Hi, I'm Nick Gregoriades, and this is the Jiu-Jitsu Brotherhood podcast, the show for grapplers and martial artists that want to evolve both on and off the mat.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jiu-Jitsu Brotherhood show. Today's guest is a highly unusual one, and the truth is he is not in any way involved in the Jiu-Jitsu world or even in the martial arts world, but he's someone who's influenced me greatly on my journey, and I just wanted to have a conversation with him, and I wanted him to be able to share his wisdom with you guys because I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say, and I think there's a lot of truth in what he says. Now, I want to make it clear before we get into the chat that I don't believe or agree with everything Michael says. There are certain things that I think are just a little bit too out there and certain things that I think he's just wrong about. But I think the vast majority of stuff he is right about, or at least he's onto something. The part that I really don't agree with that he brought up in the show was he said something along the lines of, if you're pale and male, you go to jail. And I think he was talking about referring to the fact that allegedly it's tough for white people in today's world because of affirmative action and reverse discrimination. I personally don't agree with that. I don't think that's true. I think in general, black people have a far, far harder time than white people in almost all circumstances. So I just want to make it clear that I don't agree with that statement of his. But it's an interesting opinion, and if you're an open-minded person, you have to at least be willing to listen and entertain certain thoughts. You don't have to agree with them. I think the best thing for me to do is read a piece by Michael before the show starts. And this was something I stumbled on about 10 years ago. And it was, to this day, it's one of the things that has affected me the most profoundly. And it's one of the things that influences the way I move through the world and the way I look at the world, and also the person I want to eventually become. And it's called The Creative Man versus the Destructive Man. So it defines what a destructive man is and what a creative man is. And I'll start with the destructive man. The destructive man requires external stimuli to feel alive. He is emotionally dead, and without the world of objects and other people, his life is nothing. He is deeply addicted to stimuli, which fills his psychic abyss. He cannot be still or alone. He is a shell addicted to fashion, conforming to be accepted. In his world, image and appearance are everything. His experiences are banal and casual. He performs and mimics, but abuses trust, sexuality, and beauty. What he cannot own or control, he fears. He seeks a cause and master to avoid responsibility. If his desires are thwarted, he becomes agitated, depressed, and aggressive. He is competitive and pathologically reliant on approval. He is expert at manipulation and is hypocritical and immoral. Other people, especially those with inherent power and creativity, are his prey. He feels a sense of greatness from their loss and failures. He is the enemy of true creativity, independence, and selfhood. Nothing is sacred to him except his image, external success, possessions, and his catalog of dominance. The creative man. The creative man is alive from within and inner-directed. He does not require external stimuli to feel alive, and so his relationship to the world is healthy, deep, and real. He has the best of both worlds. He has a strong sense of selfhood and is autonomous and independent in the true sense. He is a rebel. He does not cling to things or to other people for fulfillment because he is not inherently empty. His relationships are not based on power dynamics. He is present within every moment and is open to change and the future. He sees problems as challenges and has strong boundaries. He does not manipulate or deceive. He envies no one and takes charge of his own destiny. He knows that consciousness changes reality. His happiness and suffering are sacred to him. He does not censor himself or care what others do, say, or think. Evil is, for him, the absence of autonomy and selfhood. He leads and does not follow. He is in contact with the true source of life, which exists and flows from within his being. His life force is his own. He is mutable and he is ever growing. So that is, I don't want to say the guiding manifesto for my life, but it's definitely something that influences everything I do. I try to find out where I'm still being the destructive man and try to change that, and I try to become more like the creative man. I don't always succeed, but it's something I definitely try. And I think what I find fascinating about that is about this creative versus destructive man piece is you can identify that a lot in jiu-jitsu. If you look hard enough, you can see a lot of those paradigms operating in jiu-jitsu. For example, this one, he seeks a cause and a master to avoid responsibility. I remember that specifically about myself when I started training. I just wanted to put it all on the instructor's shoulders and avoid the responsibility. I just wanted to be like, okay, he's the master. I just need to copy him and be like him. And I subsequently learned that that's it's not the creative way to go about things. Anyway, guys, without further ado, here is my conversation with Michael Tsarion. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Jiu-Jitsu Brotherhood podcast. Hope you guys are all well. I have a guest on the show today, which is a bit unusual because most of the time the guests I have on are related to the Jiu-Jitsu world in some way. And this particular one, I suppose directly he isn't, but indirectly, as you will soon find out, he is, because he's going to help us with the ability to use our own minds, which I guess is the root of all martial arts, is self-mastery and self-knowledge. So I'm very, very proud to introduce someone who has influenced me greatly through his work. His name is Michael Tsarion. And Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Nicholas, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Great. So I guess you got this request out of the blue. You're not a martial artist yourself, is that correct?
Well, I don't belong to a dojo. I've practiced, Aikido light, everything light, more just the warm-ups, stretching, and basically the principles. But yeah, I've never been a joiner, so I can't even join something like a local dojo as much as what another part of my mind would love to do. So, I would really like formally to do it, but I've never found the time, or it just never came about, so I just contented myself with the literature and the principles and then some of the lighter exercises.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, as I said in the introduction, you do a martial art of a different kind, which is an internal, mental, spiritual martial art. It's one of the things I want to do with my work. It became very clear to me over the weekend that I need to start doing more of it, is using jiu-jitsu as a vehicle to help the people I engage with, in particular the men I engage with, discover more of their spiritual sides or the spiritual aspects to their nature. In fact, just this past weekend, I led a retreat in California, and one of the things I did was I opened and closed each session with 5 minutes of meditation, and that seemed to really, really help the guys, and I got a lot of feedback from them. Most of them had never done anything like that before. I think having a guy like you who has navigated those internal waters to such a degree, I think it's such a privilege for all of us. After you.
Oh, well, never forget that you are dealing with spirituality when you're dealing with the body and its movement. Part of the whole lie, there's so many fallacies in the West. There's fallacies in the East as well. But one of the big fallacies in the West is that, sitting in a yoga pose for 2.5 hours, trying not to think, and convincing yourself that silence is the noise in your head, all this paradoxical stuff, is some sort of spiritualism. It's not. That's all just packaged by a bunch of priests over in India. The real martial arts is movement, and thought follows movement, right? Again, we got it back to front where we think thought precedes action. That first you think about doing something, then you do it. That's an optical illusion. Thought is the tassel to purse. The purse is action, right? And some of the greatest philosophers in our era, and this is all known to people who study Zen, what I'm going to say now, but in the West, in the 20th century, French phenomenologists, German, let's just use the word existentialists, but phenomenologists found out something extraordinary, and that is how little conscious awareness exists when we're doing things, right? And then they went to great lengths to prove that, right? Like, you don't think of the pedals in the car when you're manipulating them. You don't think of the handle of the door when you're opening it. You don't think of your ass on the chair when you're sitting on it. You don't think of the knives and forks. So all of this action is taking place, and we're not consciously aware of it. And that backs up the point that I'm talking about, is that the person who's working with the body, like in the martial arts, I think the word arts comes to bear here. It's a huge word, a very big, broad word for such a small word. In letters, it actually means so many things. And one of the things it means to me is that we are getting conscious about that which is going on, starting with the organs, like the ancient Egyptians were fascinated by that, and all the great mystery school teachings. This is where Shinto comes from. This is where Zen Buddhism comes from, and this is undoubtedly where Qigong comes from. It's all, and Tai Chi, it's movement-based. And it's not just movement of the body, it's the fact of the movement. It's how you know the front from the back and the top from the bottom. When you got a scratch, your hand knows exactly where to go to scratch it. You know, the subject-object dichotomy. I've talked about that a lot. In martial arts, you have the opponent, don't you? Yourself and the opponent. Then on the spiritual level, you've got your lethargy as the opponent, you know, or your inability to break through that ceiling or to push through, you know, a muscle. I don't know the technical term, but, you know, to push through to go to the next level. These are all opponents and the obstacles. But it's so much more than that, right? There's an incredible dynamic there when it comes to the will, right? And this whole idea that body, it has capacities that teach us. And that you can't say mind as if it's something in the head. The mind is the totality of the body and the space that it occupies in the most physical grounding level. And how you occupy that space, you know, I'm thinking of Aikido here, but you can factor in Tai Chi and a lot of other arts. Mm-hmm. And so it's the command over your own body first. So to me, there is almost, it's like the reverse of what other spiritual people will tell you. I believe that the highest spirituality is somatic. It's of the movement of the body, whether it's in the martial arts context or something, you know, satellite to that. And of course, then general health fits into that as well. I mean, we are including here, you know, just general health for somebody who may never go further into martial arts. But at least when you're in martial arts, you are definitely taking care of the health of the body. That's one thing. But you're taking care of something far deeper than that on a very deep cellular level, the intelligence that's housed in our bodies, not just our minds.
I totally agree with you. And in fact, that's one of the things that I notice with, you know, some people who have been, I try not to say this with judgment. I don't want it to be said with judgment. It's merely an observation that very often someone will come to me who wants to be trained. And this is someone who has been so indoctrinated into the modern industrialized capitalistic system. And this guy, he sacrificed everything for his paycheck or his career. And I see it reflected in their body. This guy is so out of touch with his body. He's so stiff and his posture is terrible and he's so disconnected from his breathing. And generally people I meet that are in that state, it's true. I mean, they could go and sit and meditate for as long as they wanted to, but they've cut themselves off from the somatic awareness of which you spoke. And it just goes to show how absolutely vital that is. And conversely, the people I've met who are most in their body, I have this one friend who is a Tai Chi master, and this guy literally spends 4 hours a day just moving, just stretching and doing mobility work. And he cannot abide by having any excess or unwanted or any unnecessary tension in his body. And that reflects in his personality and his psyche. He's one of the most relaxed, balanced people I've ever met. So I'm in wholehearted agreement with what you've just described. I think that's fascinating. Michael, I wanted to ask you, the main reason I wanted to have you on the show is, you know, that piece of yours, The Creative Man versus The Destructive Man, that was so influential to me. I read it about 10 years ago, and it's literally been one of the guiding principles or one of the guiding texts in my life. Whenever I wonder what I'm doing, I go back and read that. I will have read this to the people listening to the show. I will record an introduction in which I read it to them so that they know what I'm talking about. I think a lot of people are attracted to martial arts. A lot of men in particular are attracted to martial arts because they feel something is missing. They feel that there is something to life that they just don't get. You know, there's something to themselves that they just don't get. And from the work of yours that I've studied, it seems to me that you have some pretty good answers on what that is. Could you extrapolate a little bit on that and help us understand that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's fundamental, isn't it? The thing they're missing is masculinity. We're living in a deeply feminized society. I'm not just talking about normal feminine traits. We're talking about necrophilous, extreme feminization in the pathological sense that, say, a typical psychologist accepts. And this is not something of a misogynist statement, because I'm quoting Anna Freud, I'm quoting Melanie Klein, I'm quoting Alice Miller, right, and Karen Horney. I mean, I'm getting a lot of this from them, not all of it, but they agree this is a commonplace. But we're living in such a PC, idiotic world that the moment that you try to extrapolate upon these points, people think you're a misogynist or something. And yet I can quote the Phyllis Cheslers and all the great women writers, Esther Villar, Camille Paglia, you see, who've spoken exactly along the same lines. But what the man is missing is masculinity, right? You can walk around today in a male body, and it doesn't mean you're male in the sense that we would traditionally think of it. And in fact, that traditional image is now frowned upon. If you're male and pale, that's it. To jail, you go on the Monopoly board, right? And you do not get to pass just by being male and pale. That's the end of that. God help you if there's a few other things thrown in there as well, like you're actually a nationalist or you care about the West, that's the end of it. So there's going to be, and I also endorse this, you can't keep nature down, right? So within the psyche of, here we're talking about males. So in the psyche of that male, there's going to be then, if you can't identify with heroes, then they go and identify with anti-heroes, which the people who make these Nintendo games and these Grand Theft Autos and the movies and the hideous, cartoons and all that their idiot parents expose them to, right? Then those kids then turn dark. They turn necrophilous. They're not progressing, they're actually regressing, right? Because their energies are now focused on destroying the male patriarchal world. They operate in it, not as true males, but what I call chivalric males in the Dragon Mother book. And a chivalric male, although he's beefed up and he drives a Camaro and he works out at Gold's Gym, and he throws his cloak over a puddle for every chick that turns up, right? He's totally feminized. He's not male at all. It's just a simulation of masculinity because he doesn't know what the real thing is, right? Mm. But then there's a few kids who move beyond that because they caught a Bruce Lee film, right? Or they watched fucking Chuck Norris, right? Or they checked out the Water Margin like I did when I was a kid back in the 70s and 80s, right? And they get into Japanese culture. And then, okay, the bubble gets busted of the false, personas that the West has thrown up. Although there's great Western archetypes as well, like King Arthur and Sir Lancelot and Robin Hood and all of that, and Sherlock Holmes. And they will find it again. And there's some even great movies, even in the West, that are made, like the He-Man character and things like that. But mostly they'll get into it because of the martial arts. And that's perfectly great because what they're really seeking for is the archetype of masculinity. And then it unfolds from that point. You find a good teacher, you find a good school, and you're on your way. And I'm all supportive of that because what they're missing is the heroic element.
So when you say they're missing the archetype of masculinity, what to you embodies masculinity and can you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, it's basically heroism, isn't it? It's if you go to the most grossest mundane level without some airy-fairy stuff attached to it, then it's just meeting reality as it is and getting your hands dirty, by the soil and working, building a bridge. Only 10% of our world should be voting. And the only people who should vote are the ones who are building the bridges, laying down the infrastructure, paving the roads, setting in the wires, and generally taking care of what we call a city. All the rest are just fucking parasites, right? They shouldn't have a vote, men or women. And so the type that is engaged with what reality is, who, like in the Nietzschean sense, right? Those guys are the masculine ones. And that's just on the crudest level. Going up to the next level, maybe semi-philosophically, then they're the outsiders. Right now, this has been pointed out by Gustave Le Bon and many other thinkers, Julius Evola, René Guénon, and many others. And I'm not wearing the T-shirt here. I'm just going to extrapolate. My ideas run along these same lines, but I've got differences with a lot of these things, right? But basically, what that school is saying is that look, these people are outsiders, so they don't want to join no crowd. And people like Gustave Le Bon have even gone so far as to say that the Latin temperament is collectivized, whereas the Anglo-Saxon temperament isn't. And, this has been picked up by even people like Alfred Rosenberg and all. Many, many people thought like this. And it's just a simple way of explaining that the Anglo-Saxon consciousness, right, is a loner. The male, especially the male. And the women who support him support that aspect of his alphaness, the alpha male. It's not as common in the Latin worlds, right? And this would be Italy, Portugal, Spain, and then South America, and then of the tropical countries where there's a lot of alpha men there, but they're much less. Their sense of outsiderness and individualism is a little less, even though it's certainly conspicuous. It's there as well, the hero, like the Zulu warriors or whatever. You do get it in other places, of course. It's speaking very generally. But through to his core, right down to his essence, the Anglo-Saxon Caucasian man is an outsider. And when he gets together in a tribe, those tribes tend to be smaller, and those tribes tend to be favoring that the leader or the chieftain spends a lot of time on his own and goes on walkabouts, and basically his connection with his tribe is a mercurial one. It's not collectivized. He's living with people, but he doesn't have a collectivistic mindset, right? Now, that is another level of masculinity. So it's really, at that point, then, it's the man who goes his own way. We're seeing that now in, say, MGTOW, right? It's remanifesting. Like I said, I'm just commenting. I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, because all of these things can take on an aberrant facade if you're not careful. But I'm seeing this individualism come back in sort of these strange hybrid forms. You know what I mean? And so in our age right now, it's girl power, right? The woman is the most highly collectivized creature. And then most of the men that follow them, sort of a eunuch type, the emasculated type, they would also be collectivistic in the sense that Gustave Le Bon is talking about. The very word city actually comes from the word cetus, which is for the vagina. So there's, the woman is the urbanite and the woman is the collectivistic. 5 minutes in nature, it's all over, right? The man who's heroic and the man who's masculine can handle nature and even prefers it. So if he was given a magic wand to say, what kind of life would you have? Now, it's not living in an apartment in Shanghai. No guesses. It's not living in Hong Kong. The man would want to live near a river, in an open plain with forests and horses around him, the open sky. That's America is very the proof in the pudding of that. People watching those westerns, not ancient, but the recent westerns, showed that even in Europe that became a huge genre. Why? So what I'm saying is backed up by empirical evidence. So there's a whole question of urbanization and collectivism being anti-masculine. So this is just to touch on a few of the points. There's so many things that one could say about that. And then on a higher spiritual term, well, it's just the man who then his thinking is completely outside the box, religiously, psychologically, socially, economically. He's completely outsider. He's an Emerson, a Rilke, a Heidegger, somebody who's totally broken from all the conventions. And then at that point, then he becomes what I call a sage. But of course, don't hold your breath, right? You're not going to be running into any of those at any time soon.
Wow, Michael. I mean, there's so much to unpack in what you've just described. A lot of it I don't necessarily agree with, but I do. I can definitely entertain it. The first thing that comes to mind is, the idea of the true masculine ideal being that of a loner or the outsider is very interesting because it's something that over the past couple of years, I can only speak to my own experience. But in 2013, I packed a couple of bags and sold all my stuff, and I just left on this round the world pilgrimage in which I never spent more than a couple of months in one place, and just traveled the world teaching jiu-jitsu and did a bunch of very, I want to say selfish things, because truth be told, they were very selfish. I did a lot of experimentation on many different levels, and the truth be told, I had a fantastic time. I felt very actualized. I think there was a very strong, that masculine energy in my life was manifesting in a very powerful way. But now I've come full circle, and a year ago I got married and I moved to the United States, and I've been living a much more urbanized, domesticated life. And objectively looking at both of these lifestyles, I realized that there are negative and positive aspects to both of them. And I don't think we need to choose. I think you can have the best of both worlds. I mean, for example, I've just been in the woods in Northern California for 12 days. It was a wonderful trip. I mean, I was as close to nature as I've been in a long time. And I really felt fantastic and connected. And I got to do a lot of reflection. And yesterday I got home and my wife and my little two cats were here. And it was such a wonderful thing to have a home to come back to and to have, the luxuries and the comforts of a home and urbanization. And to me, I don't think we need to choose one or the other. What do you have to say to that? What does that conjure up in your mind?
Well, in the Western world, we have both. So it's a virtue to have both. I'm not a person who ever believes that anybody should live in want. You should have everything in this short life that can. I'm completely moderate like that. Because remember, I know all too well the negatives of going away to become sort of withdrawn from the world. Neurotic. That's another kind of neuroticism where you become misanthropic, where you maybe see, because there's three levels to what we call cosmos. Physiosphere, which is the rocks, the earth, the raw earth and the raw stars, the oxygen, the air, the fire, the water. Then there's the biosphere, which is the animal and plant life. And then there's noosphere, which is mind. Well, of course, the human being being the inhabitant of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the totality of those three is cosmos. So if you regress too much to the physiosphere, like trying to get away because you become misanthropic or disenchanted or depressed with human society, of course that option to completely detach and live in up a palm tree in Acapulco or in some other under a mushroom, in Mexico, or some the fuck, that of course that option is there. A lot of people have done it. Back in the Victorian era, people went to Tibet. They said, that's it. I'm casting off all Western tropes and motifs. I'm wearing an orange robe and rolling some beads. All of this is there. I'm not against any of it because I'm not against anybody going, like you just said, and experiencing it to know what the thing is. I've done it myself, and I'm all for experiencing it. Experience with all of these different voices and cults and sects. This is what it's all about being on this planet. But don't take it too far because then you become ascetic, which is not good. Then you can't be immersed on the other side too much in the urban because that's not good. Obviously, you become more artificial as a person. But I'm always thinking about balance. If I didn't move to California, out of the greenery of Ireland, I would have never picked up Ayn Rand. I would have never picked up Nathaniel Branden. I would have never read the thousands of books that I have and be the person I am. I wouldn't have even had the career. I'd have been hung, drawn, and quartered in the streets of Belfast.
Yeah.
I'd have been completely pilloried and ridiculed, and I would have probably been locked up in a madhouse. And I'm not joking there. That's probably an absolute fact. The butterfly nets would have been at my door. I had to go to a country that promotes free thinkers and gives you. So I can't knock it. The urban life for me, helped me facilitate getting the books, getting the literature together. Having a sense of independence from the rotten family. All of that America gave me. You see. So of course. But as you say, you must dip into going into nature and connecting with that physiosphere and biosphere because it's where we come from. It's our roots. So it's not something alien to us. It's actually something that is in our DNA. And we must go back and speak with it again, frequently.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you on that. Let's go back to this idea of the suppression of masculinity. It's to me, your views are so fascinating. And as I said, I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but I know there is definitely truth in some of what you've been saying, to me at least. The thing that does worry me because I agree with you, I agree that there is definitely this kind of strange movement to suppress the masculine in the modern world. I don't know why it exists. But at the same time, what I think it is a result of is it's almost like a very strange. To me, I feel that the feminine was repressed for so long, the divine feminine. It was repressed and cut off by the dominance of the patriarchy for so long that it has now kind of it's almost like an elastic band that was stretched so far that it's snapped back too far the other way. And now that we see this kind of almost unhealthy emergence of a sort of unhealthy feminism, I think it would be a mistake to suddenly the feminine is evil or the feminine is what's caused this. I think it's something deeper and something darker than that, than just saying that it's feminism that has subverted masculinity. Would you agree that there's some truth to that?
Yeah, but I didn't say that. I said ultra-feminization akin to the psychological regression. See, going the other way, right, towards ultra-masculinization, that's no good either, because then you lose the divine feminine. So, and I have spoken about that. In 2004, I did a DVD, came out in 2006 because of a delay, called, Divination in the Goddess Tradition. And I celebrate that whole tradition. So nobody can turn around and call me, that I'm anti-woman or a misogynist or anything like that. I'm just looking at all the different stuff we have on the table. And when I looked at it, I found out that the female psyche isn't on the table. Well, then how can you have any remedies in the world if key evidence about the world order is missing? Right? As a detectives, we need in this movement, if you don't have evidence in front of you, that's the biggest handicap right there. So all I'm doing is bringing evidence of the female, the feminization, the criminal history of womankind, the power struggle that mothers create with their children, even as far back as the womb. And to answer your direct question, the patriarchy gets to be a patriarchy, even in its malignant form, but even in its benign form, because throughout the decades and centuries, women chose alpha men as their mates. Well, it even goes deeper than that. Women breed men who go on to build the patriarchy. But then as a secondary and extremely important subsidiary to that is that women of purpose and meaning and ambition always chose the patriarchal man who's responsible for establishing the patriarchy. So then when an ultra-feminist comes along to criticize the patriarchy without acknowledging their huge role in it, up to almost 70, 80%, then we know we're dealing with pathology. Because the only woman who can critique the patriarchy is one who's had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. But since all women have had something to do with it, and a vast majority of them willingly and consciously and deliberately having something to do with it, i.e. picking those men who are, the ones who cut through the jungle and the ones who build the infrastructure for you, then the whole premise of female critiquing falls apart. And it actually falls apart even earlier than that, since everyone, even Godfrey de Bouillon, any tyrant, Hitler, Stalin, was born of a woman. So for women to turn around and create hard divides between themselves and that which they say they don't like is disingenuous. That doesn't mean that I'm not against reform, but that reform must be intelligent, rational, and well-meaning, and based on the admiration of men. We don't have that with radical feminization. We've got envy, we've got blatant anger and antipathy from a bunch of completely cretinous human beings, who refuse to see this other side of it, that their own sex always has traditionally preferred the very men who built that patriarchy. And so what my work tries to show then, especially in Dragon Mother, is the female roots of the patriarchy, right? What the dynamic is between, say, a child, a boy or a girl, doesn't really matter, and the malignant mother, a particular kind of female, which is the malignant mother. In that relationship and power struggle is the seeds of the roots of the structures we call patriarchal or masculine. They're rigid, like you're saying. They become ultra rigid and toxic and necrophilous because of something that's happening in the female will, which has never been brought to the table by anyone. Or it has been brought by this and that person, but they've been airbrushed from history, and there are people of, the early 20th century or 19th century. I'm bringing it up now after a lifelong, or at least since about 89, studying this very subject. So there's a lot to be brought to the table there, and I think it's for the best. It really is for the best.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very well argued point, and for a lot of food for thought. I really appreciate the response. There's a lot of intelligence in that response. I'm going to have to digest it and or go away and reflect on it. If we go beyond the dialectic of the masculine, feminine, obviously we live in a world that it's not perfect, and there are some definite negative currents that are manifesting. If you didn't have to frame it using this suppressed masculinity explanation, why do you think the world is in the state it's in?
When you ask me intelligent questions like this is all my audience should be. Instead of taking what I say wrong, which a lot of people do, they should just, think of it like you and I are speaking right now. You're an intelligent man asking intelligent questions, and you're not entirely buying into what I'm talking about. That's all I've ever asked. There's no need for, mudslinging and complete and utter hinterlanding. These are interesting subjects. Let's talk about them as you're doing. So, I really congratulate you for that. But to answer your question there, I went into that more and say something like archetypes of control, where I said that man and woman, we are spiritual beings, right? So that means that we fly if we're not tied to the ground, right? Just like a hot air balloon, if you throw out the ballast, it will rise of its own nature. So you don't really need will to fly, to start creating and asking the bigger questions and being one with nature and all of that. Man's spirit has impediments placed upon it. So crown and gown, like William Blake, the priests and their briars, binding my desires, right? So the worst elements of the patriarchy, the establishment, the political systems have just become more and more bureaucratic. All of this, and also these worldviews, like are purveyed to us by the religions and whatever. That all of that stuff is very, 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 consensus trance. We're looking for security. And so we buy into whatever. I'm a Catholic because I grew up on the Catholic side of town. No, I'm a Protestant because I grew up on the Protestant side of town. And that's it. You're there for the rest of your life. You're a Hindu, you're a Muslim, you're a Jew, and no one can see outside that box. Of course, within those categories, you have enlightened men, right? Spinoza was a Jew. Great philosophers in the hundreds. Right? People like Sigmund Freud were Jewish. Others are Christian, you see. So you have the enlightened man within that. That's all I'm asking for. But when somebody gets incarcerated for the sense of security that they're missing, or just to get along, to go along, I think that has a huge, huge element, as well as, say, as we said just a few minutes ago, the parental dynamic. There is certain socialization as well, and the need for security and identification that also is, really, really trouble.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, I guess I might not have phrased my question correctly. So let me try it in a different way. I turn on, I don't watch much television, but every now and then I turn it on, and it seems that every single, or not every single thing, but the vast majority of content is centered around some kind of, strife or drama or war or zombies or horror or gore or something. I don't want to say perverse, but not of the highest spiritual qualities to which mankind aspires. You watch The Walking Dead, for example, and it's zombies eating each other and eating people, and death and poverty and pestilence and all these negative things that, we would think that as a species we would have lost the fascination for, considering the fact that we've been mired in them for so many thousands of years. And I guess my question is, where do you think that stems from, these people's or our society's fascination with us? Is it because of repression of certain things within the psyche due to the nature of the current system, or where do you think that comes from?
Well, we had a necrophilous relationship with our parents, and that's where it comes from. The 7 years of the Oedipus complex, then moving up even to puberty, is a power struggle, a very, very violent one. And then since the child, when they were younger than puberty, couldn't fight back at all, their will was entirely crushed, then the teenage delinquency is the first expression of something that may have been 7 years old. Or not, as the case may be, it may be just a year old, right? But I'm just speaking in pure Freudian terms, that the anger that you see in the average feral teen and all his interests, coupled with the fact of his body pubescence and the hormones going absolutely apeshit, add into the mixture. It's like adding it into a cauldron, right? The 14th tarot card is for the 14-year-old. There's a cauldron. Everything goes into it, right? It's a terrible mix of hellish stuff. And from that, a personality is going to be born. But since the background, the foundations are already necrophilous, and as you said, regressive and repressive, meeting reality is difficult, right? So there's a thing called hatred of reality, right? In which we want to move backwards towards the pleasure principle. And that's impossible because nature wants to force us towards reality principle, but the psyche, and now more and more aided by society itself, which is becoming more aggressive, the individual think, I want to go back to this pleasure principle when everything was just wonderful. So then we elect political parties, we design cities in a certain way, we sit in cubicles all day long, our whole thinking becomes, regressive. We want to go back to the womb, and you can't do that physically. So then you create surrogate wombs, like the Super Bowl, right? Or the mall, right? Yeah, the female symbolism's all over the fucking place, right? It's unbelievable. You really get into this. But you're doing it psychologically. So basically, these power struggles must come out. One of the causes of it is the repression of one's own body feeling, right? So we're intellectually advanced, but we're emotionally retarded. And we're also somatically retarded. So zombie films, of course, you have to take each one of these. They may be saying something, Twin Peaks is saying something different than Walking Dead. A gothic horror movie is saying something different than Friday the 13th, So each one of them has to be taken individually. It's very, very difficult to speak generally, although there are some general things that can be said. But again, a Disney film has got a different psychological programming, and object than, say, James Bond, for just as an example, right? There's goods and there's negatives. But in some of the gory shit you're talking about, which has more and more come to the fore, especially with these forensic shows, that is born out of the necrophilous mindset in which the body is just being consumed. A zombie is just a regressed soul back to the absolute basis of reality. So the zombie has regressed to the point where you can't regress any further. There's no conscience there. There's just a raw carnivorous body. Remember I was talking about the biosphere and the physiosphere? So this is a human that's lost everything except this ravenous hyena, crow, vulture. In fact, it's even a slur to even compare them with those animals. Those animals are still higher in a way. But these are sort of mentalities that have become so necrophilous that they're just consuming, right? They're just consuming. In fact, the original zombie films back in the 60s and 70s were often located in shopping malls because the directors wanted to show a direct parallel between the mindless zombies, shopping of a day and their zombie films. There was actually a direct, deliberate association, by the way. And it hasn't much changed later on. So there's a concept there of the consuming of zombie, right? who's been. But see, think of the real zombie. When we had real zombies in the world, they were only made zombified by giving a drug, datura, from the plant datura, which the farmer or the man who ran the plantation, i.e., the control elite, the social engineers, have to give you something to create that zombie level. So the zombie film is saying, yeah, they've succeeded. The media, right? The new datura is the media itself, dragging us down to a passive level. See, when you're watching a program of images, you don't have to read, you don't have to think, and different parts of the brain are not active anymore. You're just sitting completely passively when you watch TV. Like you said, you don't do it, and that's good.
Wow.
But all people, even adults, go back to the childhood level because children don't read, right? You have to actually go to school and learn how to read, and then you've got to learn how to decode. There's all these mental processes in learning to read. A whole different part of the brain, association. Oh my God, it's quite a stressful and difficult learning curve. Mm-hmm. But when you look at images, you're receiving information without any of that effort. And in a world in which we're already overstimulated to the point of absurdity, the brain freezes and you can't take even in, any more information. So since the emo culture, right, back in the 80s, goth culture, and the kids who just are totally vegged out, that is because they're not under, people say, we need to stimulate them more. We need to bring them into schools and get them activated. No, that's the total opposite of what you need to do. These people have been MTV'd to death, right? Their brains from their parents has been so hectoring of them, and society's demands and the teacher's demands and granny's demands and grandfather's demands and the neighbor's demands, right? And the girlfriend's demands and all the rest of it. The brain of the average teen has frozen with overstimulation. That's a kind of zombification. It's not because they're vapid and empty. It's because there's too much information. They've never been allowed a moment's silence.
Wow.
Right? So sitting watching TV programs, I don't care what's on. It could be a nature show. It could be a real positive thing. Or it could be one of these gory horror. At the end of the day, the real problem is the passivity of somebody who can no longer think. Not because there's too little to think about in the sense of vacuity. It's because the brain has frozen from overflooding of information. And that's what then the controllers use, because now you're in a zombified state of pure receptivity. What better than to show the most monstrous, evil things? So the unconscious, bypassing the rational sensor, then you fill the unconscious full of morbid, horrible stuff to create a nation of sadomasochists, and even open criminals like a Jeffrey Dahmer or what have you, right? There's so many of these people. There's more crime of this nature than there has been before.
Yeah.
That's a necrophilus culture.
I'm in total agreement with you. I mean, I'm not entirely sure or convinced that there is a group of people who are orchestrating this intentionally. I mean, I'm more of the opinion that it is certain energy currents that are causing these things to manifest. Again, that's a discussion we can have on another day. My own personal experience that I always relate is, a few years ago, I started watching this show. Everyone was talking about it, Breaking Bad. I'm sure you've heard of it. And one evening, I watched 3 episodes back to back because, these things have obviously been designed to be extremely addictive, and I just literally could not stop watching. I watched 3 hours of it or close to 3 hours of it. And I'll never forget, this was the point at which I realized that television, I realized the power of it and how unhealthy it could be. The next morning, I woke up and I was in an incredibly melancholic, depressive mood. And I just looked at the world through this very dark filter. And my experience started to reflect that as well. I just had a terrible day. And it became very clear to me, it's because that was what I had fed my psyche with the night before I slept. And then it filtered into my subconscious and my being. And I realized you have to be extremely careful with what you allow through your eyes, which are, as they say, the windows of your soul. You have to be very careful what you allow in those windows.
Well, Marshall McLuhan said that the medium is more important than the message. So the zombie is not the characters in the zombie picture. The zombie is the TV, the thing that's eating you alive, tearing your soul out. So you felt empty and vapid and less spirited, right? Inspiration. So the zombie is that which sucks you, not the characters in the individual program. That's a metaphor. They're so clever. It's the actual tube itself and the passive images. It wouldn't even really matter what images they were. These are on a scale, the worst. Yeah, but it's a sliding scale. You could even be in the same sort of. A lot of people get this kind of blues just from watching something that looks like it's up. right? Like Baywatch, because you're not them. You're not in the sun. You know, you're not riding the Harley or you're getting the chick or whatever. So, you know, it could be something even that jades people out from watching something that is a kind of an idealized image, you know, of martini advertisement or whatever. So the whole cancer of it is that images themselves only work because people are already overstimulated. The meditative man is somebody who gives himself a lot of breathing space. Like you spoke about breath earlier on, and you talked about your friend who was very loose in his body. These are exercises. You don't do that without work. These are immensely, you know, time-consuming processes, because try walking around the mall and then coming out and say, did I think of my body once? Or the clenchedness in my neck or my lower back. Try walking through the world in that way. You know, we'll use the word Zen just for sake of brevity, right? Try to walk through a crowded and not be affected by the tensions, the loudspeakers, the news, the headlines, and you'll notice this tension arising in your body, and so on. And so being able to be monitoring it, which is the art part of martial arts, this is extremely difficult. You know, me as a musician, I have to be constantly on guard for these, you know, crimps and cringes, you know, whatever it is, the wrinkles and the tensions and the nervousness and what have you. And again, we have 4 or 5 different waves, right? Brainwave states. And so these people want us juggling like a yo-yo, you know, like a bunch of juggling balls. They want to take us from the alpha to the beta to the delta, you know, I mean, all over the damn place. And in the end of it, in the mix, you forget that the beta wave even exists, you know, the calm meditative state. They got you in alpha all the time, or they got you in a hypnotic theta state or delta state where you're super impressionable. So the media, I believe they are willingly doing this from Madison Avenue and other centers, and professors from top universities have proven it, but they were airbrushed, like Brian Wilson Keyes. Read his book, Age of Manipulation or Subliminal Suggestion, and then read Douglas Rushkoff, Media Viruses, read Gene Kilborn, read Vance Packard, and these are top people from within the corporations who found out that this was going on consciously, you know, like in a kind of a Bernays sense to entrain people. So people of much greater academic eminence than myself, you know, have written about this, proving that it is indeed willful, deliberate, and conspiratorial. This is how you create one leash for many necks, you know, to create that group think and that hive think. And now we have it in plain 3D running loose in the world. And when I talk about it, it doesn't mean I'm anti-woman or anti-feminine. I'm just pointing out phenomena, evidence that anyone who's unbiased, you see, can see in the world, and hopefully we'll discuss.
For sure. Michael, I literally could talk to you for 3 days straight. But like all good things, this must end. I am so grateful and appreciative of your time. As I said at the beginning of the conversation, you're someone who has influenced me on such a deep level. If those listening are interested, and I'm sure they will be interested, and they want to follow your work and find out a little bit more about you, where can we direct them to?
Oh, just go to michaeltsarion.com. And from there, you'll get, all the articles and I got many websites, but they're all linked to that one. It's sort of a navigation page, or they can go to unslaved.com. But I want to thank you for your time and inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's always good to be talked to by intelligent people, mate. So I'm really glad we spent this time talking.
There's just something I find so interesting about that guy and the way his mind works and his thought processes. As I said in the beginning, I don't necessarily believe everything he says, but I do think he's onto something. And it's just such a pleasure for me to speak with people that have such different opinions. I really like to have my mind stretched by engaging with people like that. So it's just truly, truly a pleasure for me to engage with people like Michael. Cool, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. There's some interesting news coming up with regards to the podcast and the future of where it's headed, which I will share with you guys maybe in the next episode or 2. But just keep in mind, things are going to be changing with the Jiu-Jitsu Brotherhood podcast, and I think it's going to be changing for the better. So until then, enjoy your day and train hard.